Recording. Okay, so here's the story. First of all, welcome back and thank you for joining me. I was very sick over the entire Passover holiday and missed a lot of it, but I am, Baruch Hashem, feeling much better now. So before the holiday, my daughter, who lives in America, came for a visit, and she brought me this new MacBook. Now, I have been a Windows user for since the 80s. And this is a very, very steep learning curve. I don't know if any of you have ever made the transition from Windows to Mac. Okay, so one of the reasons I'm telling you this is because I may fumble a lot, and also because I cannot figure out how to share my screen as I usually do in the beginning of class. So if anybody can tell me, if you're a Mac user, I do not seem to have the option that I used to have to share my screen on, on the row on the bottom. So we may have to skip the letter that I prepared for today. Does anybody have an idea how to help me do that? No, yet, Lori,
you I do. I'm a Mac user. And so what you want to do for my Mac, at the bottom, you want to hover until a little row of icons appear.
I have audio, video, participants, chat, react, raise hand, share, post tools,
share.
Right, but
click.
But
what happens when
so there's a drop down, there's like a menu associated with that. Oh, wait a minute, maybe it's advanced sharing options.
No, just basic. Click share, and then you should have options. And like, you want me to do a share screen so I can show you what you're looking for?
Wait a minute.
You want to see desktop 1, and then click the share. You can click whichever option you want. Desktop 1, whiteboard, iPhone, AirPlay, iPhone.
Okay. All right. So I want to share
desktop 1.
All right. Now it says allow Zoom Workplace to share your screen. Oh, I have to go into.
Yeah.
I've never done this before, so I have to go into system settings.
Oh,
okay.
I don't have that. That's odd, but maybe it's a first time thing for you.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so let me see if that worked, and now let me see if I have the option.
Okay.
Okay, let's see if I can do this. There we go. Yeah. Okay. Yay. Okay. Thank you. That was very helpful.
Okay.
All right. So let me just, I don't know how to make, I want to make this, this whole screen thing. I want to get rid of, I want to get rid of this and show. There we go. Okay. Can you see Samech now? Thank you for your patience. Okay. So today's letter is the letter Samech, which has the numerical value of 60. We only have like 6 or 7 letters in the alphabet to finish. Samech is a pretty straightforward letter. It makes an S sound, and it looks like this. Here it is in 3 different fonts. Okay. So Samech is basically a circle. And that's actually, when you're writing Hebrew, that's actually how you write it. Okay. But I wanted to show you that it is similar to a letter that we have already learned, which is a final mem. Okay. So these are Samech, and this is the final mem. That is the form of the letter mem when it is at the end of a word. And so it is similar in that it is completely closed off. But you see that the Samech is more rounded on the bottom, okay? Rounded in every font. And the final mem is more like squared off, okay? So you see that. So the Samech is a closed circle. And as I write here, it represents the idea of infinity because it has no beginning and no end. The idea of a circle representing infinity or is also, we have a custom after a funeral that the first thing that the mourners eat when they come home after burying a loved one is an egg, a hard-boiled egg, because an egg is sort of round, and it represents this idea of like the circle of life. Okay, the word samech means to support, and here's three Hebrew words that are common Hebrew words that begin with samech. So the first is sagor, which means closed, as opposed to patuach, which is the word that means open, sagor. A sidor is a word you probably know that means a prayer book. And this word is from here right to left, Sivan, which is the third Hebrew month starting with Nisan. Nisan, we are at the end of Nisan right now. Nisan, ER, and then Sivan. Okay, so there you have no, okay. That was that was Sivan. I mean, that was the letter Samech. And as usual, Teresa, it's so nice to see your actual face. Okay. What I'm going to do now is attempt to line this up so that I have you guys on one side of me and today's lesson on the other side, which is going to take a little bit of doing. I'm assuming that you cannot see my screen anymore. Is that accurate?
I can.
You can still see my screen?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's weird. You mean it not that you see me, but do you see my notes?
No, no, sorry.
No.
Okay. All right. So here we are. Okay. Today's topic, as I promised, is a deep dive into anti-Semitism. And it was a very difficult lesson for me to prepare. And I want to give you it was interesting. I did a lot of preparation for this yesterday, which was Yom HaShoah, which is an interesting day to be thinking about and looking deeply into anti-Semitism. But for our purposes today, there are a number of different ways to look at the causes and the purposes of anti-Semitism. I just wanted to start with a story because I remembered this when I was younger, much younger. I was a young woman. I don't know. My mother, Alea Shalom, God rest her soul, she was a big reader, as I am. And she recommended a book to me called Clan of the Cave Bear. I don't know if any of you have read this book. It's not a Jewish book at all. It's a book about, it's set in like prehistoric times. And there's a war or like a battle between this is the way I remember it, the flatheads and the roundheads. Okay. So the reason that I mention this is because I think it was meant to be a novel that sort of meditates, or it meditates might not be the right idea, but it sort of reflects on the notion that we are built to hate people who are different from us. It's interesting. I just finished a novel, a beautiful, beautiful novel about it's set in it starts out, part of the story is in 1939, like in the early 40s, and part of the story is contemporary times. And it's a story of a woman. She is now 90, and when she was a young woman, even like 17 years old, she is white and she fell in love with a black man. And she, in the state where they lived, a marriage between races was illegal, actually, in the like until, I don't know, the 1960s or something. And so the story unfolds about the price that they paid for loving each other. And I'm only mentioning this because we're going to talk about anti-Semitism, and I want to say that anti-Semitism is it's a unique kind of hatred, and it is unique in three different ways. First of all, it is a supernatural kind of a thing. The hatred of the Jew has a supernatural quality to it. So what do I mean? When an anti-Semite hates, whatever an anti-Semite hates or is fearful of, that's what they ascribe to the Jew. So Jews have been hated for being communists, and Jews have been hated for being capitalists, for having dual loyalty if we live outside of Israel, or for being separatists if we live in Israel. We are hated for being poor, and also hated for being financially successful. We are hated for assimilating, and also hated for remaining apart. There's in the book of Numbers, in the book of Bamidbar, chapter 23, verse 9, there's this, I'm sure you know this story, the pagan prophet Bilam. I don't know what you call him. What do you guys call him? Bilam. Okay. Bilam says about the Jewish people, it is a nation that will dwell alone and will not be reckoned among the nations. Okay. So that theme, um, let me just continue, because we've also been accused of drinking the blood of non-Jews, that's or using it to bake our matzah, that's a blood libel, of causing plagues, of plotting to conquer the world, and of course, I have to mention, also accused of murdering Jesus, murdering God. Okay, so so it's not a normal kind of. It's not the flatheads versus the roundheads. It's not black versus white. It's some other kind of supernatural something that's baked into the world. Okay. Anti-Semitism goes way, way beyond discrimination, and it often includes violence against Jews. In every society where Jews have lived, we've been subjected to beatings, to torture, and even murder just because we're Jews. Persecuting Jews is often equated with the idea of saving the nation that the Jews live among. So the best example of that is obviously Nazi Germany, where killing Jews was portrayed as a way of protecting German society. And so sometimes anti-Semitism turns into a proposal of actual annihilation of the Jews. It's very interesting and not coincidental to watch right now. What are the Jews being accused of doing in Gaza? We're being accused of genocide, which is exactly what the world has done over and over again. So let's go back to the Bible. Okay, in Shemot, in the book of Exodus, this is Pharaoh speaking about his plan to annihilate the Jews, when he says, get ready, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they increase and a war befall us, and they join our enemies and wage war against us and depart from the land. Okay, so this is like the beginning of his plot to get rid of the Jews. And of course, in the book of Esther, this you'll find in chapter 3, verse 6. This is Haman. But it seemed contemptible to him, to Haman, to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had told him Mordecai's nationality, and Haman sought to destroy all the Jews who were throughout Ahasuerus's entire kingdom, Mordecai's people. Okay, so this idea of annihilating the entirety of the people, of the Jewish people, did not start in this generation. It didn't start with Nazi Germany. It goes all the way back to biblical times. And even if you look in the book of Tehillim, in the book of Psalms, chapter 83, verse 5, King David writes about the enemies of the Jews proposing genocide. This is what he said. They said, come, let us destroy them, meaning the Jewish people, from being a nation, and the name of Israel will no longer be remembered. That's Tehillim 83:5. Okay, so we're seeing in even in the Torah over and over again this theme of just wiping the Jews off of the face of the earth. I know that you all know about the Holocaust, and some of you know much more about all of the anti-Semitic things that happened to the Jews, often through the Christian world. But I want to tell you about one you may not be so familiar with. The Chmelnytsky massacres were in Eastern Europe in the mid 17th century, 1648, 1649. Not as well known as the Holocaust, but very similar in intent. And during these massacres, all Jews, including infants, were targeted for murder. And it wasn't a war. It was the entire population, the general population, that participated in the torture and degradation of Jews. If you read a description of the Chmelnytsky massacres, it reads very much like a description of the October 7th atrocities. It's not new. I actually had a paragraph and I thought I'm going to read it to you. And then I thought I'm not going to do that because it's a little too fresh for us right now. But it is very much the same kind of barbaric attempt to wipe out the entirety of the Jewish people. And obviously, in the case of what Nazi Germany called the final solution, what is that? The final solution. Now the world is going to be rid of the problem of the Jewish people. And today, the current push to eradicate the state of Israel, which we're seeing very, very specifically on college campuses, but also with all the pro-Hamas, pro-Palestinian protests around the world, this is the goal of destroying the Zionist entity. I don't know if you're aware that from the river to the sea means let's get rid of Israel, let's get rid of the entirety of the Jewish people. It's just the latest incarnation of this eternal push to annihilate the Jews that repeats over and over again in Jewish history. And the third thing that makes it unique is that this is a book that just came out. It's called Dark Clouds Above, Faith Below by Rabbi Moshe Taragin. And it's ruminations about October 7th, different like op-eds that he wrote or Torah articles that he wrote about it. And he says, this is a quote, "Tragically, anti-Semitism is baked into the fabric of history." There's another book called Why the Jews, which I really highly recommend. It's by Prager and Telushkin. I'll send a link to it after we're finished. This is what they say. At one time or another, nearly every major country that has had a large Jewish population has regarded this group, which never constituted more than a small percentage of its population, as an enemy. Now, the whole time that I lived in America, which was my whole life up until I was about 50 years old, everybody always said, Jews talked among ourselves and said, this nothing like that could ever happen in America. It can't happen here. And now, unfortunately, we're clearly seeing just the next iteration of this supernatural force that God introduced into the world. I'm going to talk more about this, but there are a lot of explanations of anti-Semitism, and many of them, if they're not speaking from a spiritual perspective, are economic or political in nature. I find that those are insufficient because there's something deeper about anti-Semitism. And so I'm not really going to look at the economic or the political analysis piece of it. I'm going to try to give you a more spiritual perspective, okay, on what we have understood. I have to say, as I was preparing this lesson, I was thinking I really need to say all this to Jews because there's a lot that's relevant to Jews at the end, because Andrea, who is not with us tonight, but I asked, she asked me to say something about anti-Semitism and non-Jews, and I'll say something about that at the end. But for right now, this is one of what I believe to be one of the spiritual sources of anti-Semitism. And it is the teaching of the oneness of God and his laws. What do I mean by that? By affirming that there is only one God for all of humanity. Judaism implies that everyone else's God is illegitimate. And I believe this to be a reason why Christian anti-Semitism was especially harsh and why missionizing Jews continues until today. But it is true that we'll talk about this in more detail, but anti-Semites hate Jews because we live by our own all-encompassing set of laws and because we insist on the eternality of our national identity, regardless of where we live. And I think even if it's subconscious, unconscious, not something that people say, like they say, why did they say they hate the Jews? Because let's just take today's situation, for example, because we're genociding the poor Palestinians. That's just today's excuse. That's just today's cover story, literally. But it's just um, the rationale for Jew hatred today. There's another element, and that is the doctrine of chosenness or divine election, which is the idea, and I actually said this to you when, in what I think is the most positive way I can say it, the idea that Jews have a mission to bring the world to the belief in one God and his moral law, that in and of itself is a spiritual source of anti-Semitism akin to kill the messenger. So the very mission of Judaism to change the world for the better, to challenge false gods, to make moral demands of people, has been seen as threatening to those nations or those people within the nations who they want to act the way they want to act. They want to act without an external moral compass, which is what the Jews insist is what Torah is about and what God demands of humanity. Okay, I'm not talking about keeping the 613 mitzvot that is only incumbent upon the Jewish people. I'm talking about a basic level of morality that is determined not by what people want to do, but by an external, eternal God who demands moral behavior. Another reason, a deeper reason, is brought forward is jealousy of the Jewish quality of life. So in almost every society, Jews have been better educated. Jewish family life has been more stable. Jews have aided one another better than non-Jewish neighbors have supported one another. And I'll give you a couple of examples of this in just like everyday Jewish life. We have something called gemachim. Gemachim are in every religious Jewish community. Sometimes it's money. Sometimes it is, you can have a gemach, which is, it's like a lending. I don't even know how to describe it. It's like if you need something, but you don't want to buy it or you can't afford to buy it, you can borrow it. Here's a good example. So my younger daughter who lives in America was here over Pesach, I mentioned, and she is civilly married, but she's not been married under a chuppah. So that is coming, God willing, in September. And she needs a wedding dress. So we took her to the local wedding dress gemach. It's a room that has hundreds of wedding dresses that you can borrow. You pay a nominal fee, what amounts to maybe $150, something like that. And you borrow the dress and the shoes and like everything that you need for the bride. And then you just get it cleaned and then you return it. Okay. That is one of dozens of gemachim that exist in our community and in many, many other communities. There's a prescription medicine gemach. There's a baby formula gemach. There's a gemach for grape juice. Like if it's Friday afternoon and you realize you don't have wine or grape juice, you can go to somebody's house and get a bottle of grape juice. Because in Israel, especially, like all the stores are closed early on Friday afternoon. And whatever people need, there's gemachim for if you're making a party and you need tables or chairs, you can borrow them from or platters or whatever. You can borrow them, and this is like very, very common in the Jewish community. On top of which there are tzedakah or charitable organizations that raise money when this I'm sure you know about, when October 7th happened and the state of Israel called up 300, something like 350,000 reserve soldiers. They did not have equipment for 350,000 reserve soldiers. And so I know that probably many of you donated money, but there were organizations that raise money for specific things within that the Jewish community needs. So that's an example. This is all part of one of the sources. The proposed sources of anti-Semitism is jealousy of the Jewish quality of life. In addition, I will say that Jews generally have, this is changing the more assimilated we get, but historically it's true that alcoholism has been much less, divorce has been much less, spousal abuse has been much less, husbands abandoning children has been much less in the Jewish community, even in the non-religious community. It does happen, but it's a matter of percentage or prevalence. And so this higher quality of life, according to this way of thinking, has provoked jealousy among non-Jews. Now, I'm not saying any one of these things is the answer. I'm exploring with you um, the larger picture. So there's something about Judaism itself, and by extension, its followers, the Jews, that represent a threat to the core values or allegiances or beliefs of others that arouses this universal, deep, lasting hatred. Whatever the specific reason that's given for anti-Semitism, this is what is at the core. People don't like to be held to a higher standard than what they choose for themselves. And the Jew represents that as a divine ideal, even if we don't always achieve it ourselves on a personal level. So you could have Jews who cheat, Jews who lie, Jews who commit crime. That's totally possible. And it happens, unfortunately. But the idea, the Torah idea, the Jewish idea, the God idea that Judaism represents is what people unconsciously, according to this way of thinking, unconsciously what they are responding to when they express anti-Semitism. Period. I'm going to take a breath, and I'm going to tell you a whole different approach. Okay. This different approach concerns the Jews much more than the rest of the world. And that is, anti-Semitism is a tool that God uses when Jews want to assimilate. Okay. This holds Jews accountable for causing Hashem to use anti-Semitism in order to punish us when we try to assimilate. Yeah. This next little piece I'm going to tell you, I got from Rabbi Pinchas Winston. He has written about this and he's been teaching me about this for many, many years. So he says racism is a function of difference. In other words, if somebody like a flathead, a roundhead, black or white, or whatever the source of racism is, you hate the other person because they're different from you. Anti-Semitism, he says, is the result of a lack of difference. That is, when Jews want to be too much like the rest of the world, relinquishing our God-given distinctive mission, that's when anti-Semitism pops up. So he shares a quote from Leviticus, the book of Vayikra, chapter 20, verse 26, where he says to the Israelite nation, I have separated you from peoples that you should be mine. Rashi, the 12th century big commentator, says about this verse, he expands on, he basically says to the nation, if you separate yourselves from them, then you are mine. Okay, he's speaking like in God's language. He says, if not, then you will become subject to Nebuchadnezzar, who was the king of Babylonia, who destroyed the first temple, and others like him. Okay, so this is the message to the Jews. if you over and over again, the Jews get this message all through Tanakh, all through Jewish history, that if you do what God says and you understand that you were chosen, and I'm using that word carefully because I don't mean chosen like better than everyone else. I mean chosen for a specific purpose. If you do the job that God gave you to do, very good, lots of blessings, all good things. If you forget who you are and what God created you to be, then I'm going to bring enemies against you, and they're going to remind you of what your job is. So Rabbi Winston says we are, that is when I say we, I'm now speaking about the Jewish people. We are a separate nation based on Torah, and we can't just walk away from it and expect God to leave us alone. So here he quotes again Leviticus chapter 26, verses 14 through 25. I truncated this a little bit, but this is the message over and over again. If you do not listen to me and you do not perform all these commandments, and if you despise my statutes and reject my ordinances, not performing any of my commandments, thereby breaking my covenant, here's the consequence. I will bring upon you an army that avenges the avenging of the covenant, and you will gather into your cities. I will incite the plague in your midst, and you will be delivered into the enemy's hands. Okay, this is a pretty clear message. And I'm going to share with you a little bit about a little bit from the Talmud. He expands on this a little bit. Okay, so one of the rabbis asks another rabbi, has anyone heard why it was called Har Sinai? Har Sinai is Mount Sinai, the temple of there was in our former community, Har Sinai was the name of a Reformed temple. But here I'm speaking about Har Sinai, the mountain on which God gave the Torah. Okay, so he's asking, why is it called Har Sinai? And so one of the rabbis answers him, it was the mountain upon which Nisim, which are miracles, were performed for the Jewish people. And so he says, well, then it should be called Har Nisai. Nisim, Nisai, you hear the connection? Shake your head if you're following. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Helen. Okay, so another rabbi says it was a mountain that was a siman tov, a good sign for the Jewish people. So somebody said, then it should be called Har Simanai. Okay. So he doesn't like any of these answers. It's not a satisfactory answer. So somebody says to him, why don't you go visit these other rabbis who study more deeply and ask them, why is it called Har Sinai? And they said, so he does that. I'm paraphrasing this piece of the Gemara, but he says, they say to him, why is it called Har Sinai? Because it was the mountain from which Sinah is hatred, descended to the Gentile nations. So now you have this relationship. Okay, up until now, the people who would become the Jewish people, the Israelites in the desert years, okay, these escaped slaves were basically a family. It's a large family, but basically a family. We don't really have our own, we don't have the Torah yet, so we don't really have all of the elements of nationhood. We don't have our land yet, and we're wandering in the desert. And God gives us the Torah and says, now you are required to follow these laws forever and ever. As long as you are my people, we have this special relationship. It's a little bit like a marriage, right? Once you're married, you have certain obligations to the person to whom you are married. And if you violate those obligations, there are consequences. So theoretically, if you are single and you are sleeping with more than one person, okay, it may not be the most moral thing, but it's not against the law, whatever. Nobody can, you can't get in trouble for that, at least not in the world we live in today. But once you're married, there are consequences of violating the covenant, the covenant of marriage. So it's very, very similar. Okay. So now we have a covenant, and So Rabbi Winston goes on to say that the giving of the Torah was the most awesome event in human history. And why is it not associated with something equally positive, like the miracles that happened there? Why do we call Har Sinai, which is Sinah, which is hatred? Why does the giving of the Torah introduce hatred into the world? Okay. So we're going to go like a little bit deeper, because the Talmud goes with this third opinion that the giving of the Torah introduced anti-Semitism into the world, and it's not a very good selling point. And he says this is his answer, and it's a little Kabbalistic. He says that chaos rules the world, and the only way to fight against chaos is with Torah. So if the Jewish people don't learn Torah, then the world reverts back to what it was the null and void of the first day of creation, because in some form or another, so wars, political havoc, also they are a consequence of the Jews not doing our job, basically. So here's another element of the discussion. What if a Jew says, okay, so I'm not going to learn Torah and chaos results from that. I'm going to avoid it just so that I don't have to follow the Torah, because that's like a heavy burden. I don't want to do that. So I'm just going to opt out. And this is what Rabbi Winston says, the opting out, for any Jew to opt out, creates or expands anti-Semitism, because Torah was given on Har Sinai, which introduced Sinah, which is hatred, which is anti-Semitism. You see that the whole thing is, it's all connected. So he says that in World War II, there were secular Jews who thought they're going to escape the Nazi roundup and deportation to the camps. There were, because they were not religious, they were not like so Jewishly identified. Between 1933 and 1939, this is something that I didn't even know until he taught me this. 160,000 Jews were given the opportunity to leave Germany for what was then Palestine, pre-state Israel, 1933 to 1939. It was some agreement between the Jewish Agency and the Nazi Party in order to get Jews out of Germany. Okay. And it allowed them to leave for pre-state Israel, for Palestine, to take their possessions with them, and to leave like in a respectable way. Only 60,000 left. 100,000 of the ones that were eligible remained because they believed that they were just as German as the Germans, and they all died. They were, I say died, but they were all killed in the Holocaust. Okay, so in their minds, they were barely Jewish, but in the mind of the enemy, a Jew is a Jew is a Jew is a Jew. And he goes on to say that this message is embedded in the Shema. So I'm assuming that you are all familiar with the 6 words Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. But Shema actually is a much longer prayer. It has that's sort of the intro, and it has 3 paragraphs. And in the second paragraph, which you will find, by the way, in Devarim, in Deuteronomy chapter 11, verse 14, if you want to look at it, there's the line, and you will gather in your grain. Now, what does that mean? Okay, so in the book of Joshua, it talks about chapter 1, verse 8. This Sefer Torah shall not depart from your mouth. So one might think that this is meant to be taken literally, meaning you are supposed to combine. Now, this is instruction for the Jew. Combine the study of Torah with a worldly occupation, and that's one view. And there's another view that, like, how is that possible? Because a worldly occupation takes up all of your time. You're so busy working that you have no time for Torah study in any serious way. So there's in Yeshayahu, which is Isaiah, chapter 61, verse 5, it says, and this is actually very relevant for the work of Hayovel, that strangers shall stand and feed your flocks. What is the idea? That when the Jewish people perform the will of God, some of their work is performed by others. In other words, their job, the job of the Jewish people, according to this way, is study Torah, teach about God, teach humanity about morality, and so forth. And in addition to sharing that with the world will respond in gratitude by helping us with in the case of this discussion in the Talmud, it is it's all agricultural, like they'll help us with our agricultural work. Okay. But he says, if the Jewish people don't perform the will of God, then their work is carried out. They have to carry out their work. Okay. They will gather in their own grain. And not only is this the case, but even the work of others will be done. So again, if you look in Devarim, in Deuteronomy, chapter 28, verse 48, you will serve your enemy. So this is a prophecy that if you do what I ask of you, not that it's the easiest thing in the world to live as a faithful Jew, but the Talmud is making the point that Jews who keep God's laws will be blessed, and those who don't will be cursed in a few places. I'm gonna skip this story. It's a story about a woman, a young Jewish woman who she comes from a wealthy home and she marries into a wealthy home, and the rabbi who officiated at her wedding finds her pulling out, it's a little gross, pulling out wheat kernels from the dung of an Arab animal, because her family did not give charity in the way that the Torah requires them to. And so they lost all their money and they were reduced to this. Okay. That's basically the story. I'm just going to skip it for now. So the point of the story is that there are real consequences for Jews who stray from God's commandments. In this particular case, there were two very wealthy families that lost their wealth because they weren't careful with the mitzvah of tzedakah. But in what I'm describing to you, anti-Semitism is a consequence for Jews who stray from God's commandments. Anti-Semitism is not racism. It's the inevitable result of straying from the Torah, even if it takes years or sometimes decades to become apparent. Any peace or success that Jews enjoy through history is a result of their Torah keeping the chaos of the world at bay. Okay, so anti-Semitism and the chaos from which it emerges is like Rabbi Winston compares it to water behind a dam. So the water is constantly trying to break through the wall, and if it does, everybody drowns, right? That's the nature of water. So if the wall cracks or breaks or falls down, the water just does what water does. So just to explain the analogy further, anti-Semitism never stops trying to break through the wall of protection that is created by Jews when we live according to the way that God intended Jews to live. Okay, now he talks about Jacob, Yaakov Avinu, Jacob, our forefather, who understood this, and he tells the story. So you know the story that after he takes the blessing from his brother Esau, he's forced into exile, and he goes to live with his mother's brother Lavan, and he agrees to work for him for 7 years to marry Rachel, who's his first cousin. But Lavan fools him and gives him Leah. And so he agrees to work for another 7 years. So in addition to those 14 years, he works for another 6 years. So he's living in the house of Lavan for 20 years. And then what happens? In Bereshit, in the book of Genesis, chapter 31, verses 20 to 21, it talks about how Jacob runs away. He runs away from Lavan without telling him where he's going, and he takes everything that he has and he crosses the river. Okay. Now, on the surface of it, this is hard to understand. First of all, the Torah doesn't say that Jacob is that he's in any kind of danger, that he has to flee for his life. I mean, after 20 years, you can understand that he wants to go home, but it's not understandable why he couldn't do it in a normal way, saying, it's been real. Thank you very much for the 20 years of hospitality. And later on in the story, Lavan says, if you would have told me you were leaving, I would have thrown you a party. Now, we know that the character of Lavan is a trickster and he's not trustworthy. And that gets proven over and over again. So Jacob is perhaps concerned that that Lavan might prevent him from leaving and that the situation would have gone sour. But they both believe that God is with Jacob and he's protected him for 20 years. So wouldn't God make sure to protect him from the lies, Yaakov's lies? More than that, wouldn't Jacob have known that Lavan would eventually catch up with him? Because he's traveling, with his 4 wives and his all of his children and all of the animals and all that stuff. So what made him run? Okay. And to find out what made him run, Rabbi Winston sends us to the book of Genesis, Bereshit, chapter 31, verse 1. He heard Lavan's son saying, Yaakov, Jacob, has taken everything that belonged to our father. From our father, he has gained so much. Now, the truth is, it was the other way around, because when Jacob first came, Lavan had no sons. That's why Rachel was tending the sheep, when he first arrived, because there were no boys in the family to do it. And the brothers, now he's been there 20 years, they owe their very existence to Jacob. But it wasn't only that. If in the next verse, Jacob heard something that changed, saw something that changed. So he hears now his brothers-in-law are murmuring against him. But then in chapter 31, verse 2, Yaakov saw Lavan's face and it wasn't the same as before. Okay. So what is this all about? There's a teaching. This is the literal translation of it is halacha that Esav hates Yaakov. Okay. So halacha, you may know, is the word for Jewish law. So Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, who lived in the 20th century in America, in New York, he said, why is the word halacha relevant here? It's because just as halacha, that is Jewish law, never changes, so Esau's hatred of Jacob never changes. Even in those nations that behave well toward the Jews, their hatred of the Jews, it still exists. Esav, Lavan, Bilam, Hitler, Stalin, over and over and over again, they're all the same in this respect. And Jacob never lost sight of the fact that if Lavan would have had the ability to sort of express his anti-Semitism and his sons, then Yaakov wouldn't be safe. And he knew that any civility that they displayed to him was because of God's protection, not because of them. They were the water that was kept at bay through the Torah and the mitzvahs of Yaakov. Okay. So when Yaakov now sees that they're a little bit less civil, like a big red flag, he says that means the divine protection that's been keeping him safe and successful for these 20 years is it's over or it's waning and it's time for him to go. And so how does this relate to today? This is, again, Rabbi Pinchas Winston's teaching. When exile is necessary, so it was necessary for Yaakov to leave Israel. He had to do that. He fled for his life. Okay. It is sometimes necessary for Jews to be exiled for God's reasons. When exile is necessary, God sends protection in the form of the Shekhinah, which goes into exile with the Jewish people to protect them. But when the exile is over, when it is time for the Jews to leave that exile, just like it was time for Yaakov to leave the house of Lavan, then that protection is withdrawn. So every exile has a set time, and there comes a time when every exile, when the Shekhinah moves on, and what happens without that protection, without that wall, that is when anti-Semitism pops up. So anti-Semitism and increased animosity by a host nation has historically been the clue that it is time to go. This chapter is finished. And this is why, what I believe, why we're seeing what we're seeing. For those of you that don't live in the US, I apologize that I'm very America-ocentric, but that's the community that I understand the best. The reason why Yaakov left in such a hurry, he understood that his protection was diminished now, and it was time to move on. It is a lesson over and over and over again that's repeated, but most of the time, when anti-Semitism increases in a society, the Jews just try to stay safe where they are in the diaspora. They continue to live the lives that they're living without realizing that their protection has um, has left or is on the way out, and the enemy grows stronger and eventually grows very dangerous. So number one, this is what I believe that we're seeing on the college campuses and in American society, that it is a message from God to the Jews. It's time to go. You've been here, you've had a nice run, it's all been very good. Now it's time to move on. And this is why giving of the Torah is associated with Sinah, to remind us that the Sinah that comes naturally to a chunk of mankind can be kept at bay if the Jewish people follow the rules of Torah, and the civility of the nations is a result of God's protection. But it is only it's only temporary. Now, I want to say something. I watched a video this week about what's going to happen to the nations in the time of Mashiach. And the thing, I was thinking about all of you because he divided the nations into three groups. The first group he called Amalek. Those are like the true enemies of the Jews. They're just atheists. They just hate God. They all that stuff, and they're going to get annihilated. He said, then there's also the nations, which the word he used was goyim, which is literally the word for nations. But then he said there's a third category, and this is all of you, and that's what he called umim or leumim, which is also, it also means nations, a people group, whatever. But he said these are the ones that cast their lot with the Jewish people, and he said they will be okay. So you should just know that when I'm speaking of the nations here, I'm not really talking about all y'all. I'm talking about the people, the people who hate the Jews. Now, there's a story, a midrash, that before God gave the Torah to the Jewish people or to the Israelite nation, he offered it to all the other nations, the 70 nations that existed at the time. And he went to them and he said, however you understand this, here's my Torah. Do you want it? Do you want to be obligated by the Torah that I'm about to give into the world? And they said, one after another, well, what's in it? And he said, well, it says you can't kill. And they said, nah, we don't really want that. Okay. And then he went to another nation and he offered them the Torah, and they said, well, what's in it? And he said, you, whatever the moral law is. Okay. And they said, no, we're going to pass. Okay. So all of the nations turned down the Torah. There's a very interesting teaching as a result of this story, which I just told you very briefly, that people who are drawn to Judaism in other generations are reincarnations of people who were part of one of the nations that turned the Torah down, but they personally would have voted yes, like they were outvoted. Their nation said no. But the people who are aligned with Torah, aligned with the Jewish people, maybe even converting to join the Jewish people, are the souls of people who actually wanted to accept the Torah way back when at the time. There's another, we're running out of time, but I want to finish and then get to the part about Andrea's question. There's another related reason that I learned from one of my teachers for anti-Semitism, and that is also on the Jews, that deep in them, in a way they may not even be aware, that the non-Jewish world knows that when the Jews keep Torah, we help bring Geula, which is good for everyone. Redemption is good for everyone, and they're angry with us because we haven't brought the Geula, and that anger unconsciously expresses itself as anti-Semitism. So again, the whole idea here is there's explanations or reasons that give the responsibility to the anti-Semitic nations, and there's a whole other way of thinking that anti-Semitism, it's like on us, when us meaning it's on the Jews. That it's a punishment. Now I'm gonna have to skip a whole bunch of stuff because I want to get to just a little statement, a note about anti-Semitism for non-Jews. Okay, so anti-Semitism, it's a Jewish problem, but it's also a symptom of something that's sour in a culture or in a society. So Dennis Prager and Joseph Telushkin, in this book that I told you about, Why the Jews, they say this: treatment of the Jews has served as one of humanity's moral barometers. If you watch how a nation, religion, or political movement treats Jews, you will have an early and deadly accurate picture of that group's intentions towards others. The anti-Semites first wish to destroy the perceived embodiment of that higher calling to the good represented by the Jews, but they don't hate the Jews alone. They hate whatever and whoever represents a higher value or a moral challenge. Those who hate the Jewish nation are often the most likely to hate America as well, because America represents freedom, a higher quality of life, and a willingness to fight for its values. Okay, so you see that what are we seeing on like the American college campuses is, death to Israel, death to America. They're linked because anti-Semitism is like the canary in the coal mine. It's the indication that a society is starting to lean in the direction of immorality, I guess I'll call it. So Andrea asked me, I don't know if she asked in the group or she asked me privately, what can she do? And the truth is there's not a whole lot, but non-Jews can certainly pray. They can donate to people who need help. They can write and speak against anti-Semitism. If not for the sake of the Jews, then for the sake of helping to heal whatever country that they live in, because anti-Semitism never ends with the Jews. And okay, so that was my goal, was to give you, I skipped a few things, but I think you got many of the main messages, like to give you the ideas of what the Torah and what history says about how anti-Semitism is not a simple thing at all. It's not it is not it's not a hatred like any other. It's not simple hatred of people who are different from you. There's much, much more to it. So it is, what time is it? We have 2 minutes. Does anybody want to ask or respond in any way? You need to unmute yourself, Lori.
Can you repeat those three categories of the nations? The one that you put us in, was it Umim?
Umim. Yeah.
Umim.
Umim. So it's Amalek, who's the real bad guys. Then the Goyim, the nations that are not so fond of the Jews, but tolerate us in if we're doing what we're supposed to do. And then the Umim are the ones that understand, that see what I've tried to share with you today about the that this really isn't about land. This, what we're living through right now, you understand this, right? This is really like tov v'ra, good and evil. This is a spiritual battle that we are all watching play out. And so everybody has a chance to decide. So the Umim are non-Jews who see and understand what's going on in the world, and they align themselves in some way with the good, which is Israel and the mission of the Jewish people. That's anyway how I see it. Helen, you want to say something?
Well, yeah, I guess I'm the only one from England here, but I'm concerned about our nation. But any nation that loses its Jewish community from history goes into decline.
That's a lesson of history that, one year on Tisha B'Av, which is the 9th of Av, it's the anniversary of the day when the two temples were destroyed. It's a very, very difficult day. My husband and I did this program in his synagogue. Someday I have to tell you the full story of it, but one of the things that we did, we acted out like there was a pogrom in Baltimore coming, and we all had to escape, and we made an escape plan. And one of the things that we talked about was every country, there's a list somewhere, and the UK is certainly there, of every country that has ever kicked out its Jews. And it sometimes more than once, like you get kicked out of a country and then you're 100 years later or 500 years later, whatever, you're welcome back.
Yeah.
It If I'm looking around, okay, so Ada, you're not in the US, and Helen, you're not in the US, and Kathy, you're not in the US, that Kathy Morgan, but I would be very concerned if I was an American right now. I mean, I'm an American citizen, but whatever, like if I lived there now, I would be very concerned with what's happening because, as you said, like we're not at the point where Jews are fleeing for their lives not from any of the countries where you guys are in, but something's turning. Something's
Yeah.
turning. And according to Rabbi Winston, he would say it's a message to the Jews that it is time to move on. But whatever it is impacting the entire world. And the Jews and Israel are at what do you call that when there's a storm, like the eye of the storm, but it's really not about that. It is, but it isn't. Like that's just um it's just an excuse. Not excuse isn't the right word, but um it's like the cover story. What's really going on is how healthy is the society. And that's why one of the quotes that I said to you was the barometer of the health of a nation is how does it treat its Jews. And
Exactly.
the truth is America was very good to the Jews for a long time, but those days seem to be over. So anybody else before we finish up? You good? Okay. This is a little heavy.
Sorry, I just
Yeah.
one more question. But do you ever, I mean, you mentioned about God using anti-Semitism, but the Holocaust and the 7th of October were so dreadful that it's like beyond, it's hard to see it as the hand of God. I sort of just think, oh, it's completely demonic. Do you see it like that, or is that
Okay. It's a great question, and it's a very deep question. And I'm going to
sorry?
give you no, I'm going to give you the
It's just I'm
answer.
struggling with all this. Yeah.
Right. For sure. I'm going to give you the answer that comforts me. Okay. And this may or may not resonate for any of you, but this is how I understand it. We do not live in one lifetime. Our souls exist over multiple lifetimes. That's what I believe. And what happens to us in one lifetime is not the entirety of our experience. And sometimes, so God has a calculation that we are so small compared to God and compared to his running of the world that we perceive things as demonic, as horrible. And the two examples you gave, I mentioned the Chmelnytsky murders, the massacres in the 17th century.
Yeah.
There are other examples of that, of things, even take it outside of a Jewish context completely. In general, humans are not always nice to each other. And that's a gross understatement, right? But history is filled with individuals and massacres and violence and horrible treatment and all that. And the nature of evil in Jewish thinking, it's very deep. I'm actually studying this with one of my learning partners, but to try to answer you briefly, it requires a tremendous, tremendous amount of emunah to be alive in this generation, and to trust that God knows what he's doing, and what looks to us as cannot possibly be associated with a God that is good, with a God that is loving. It requires a tremendous amount of faith that and understanding that in comparison to God, how tiny we are, and how big God is, and how big his plan is for the world, and also to believe that one day we're going to understand. We're going to understand what was the path of each of our souls. Why did we suffer the way that we did? Why did we live in the time periods that we did? Why did what happened? Oh, that whole thing. My husband calls it the like the last lecture, the big talk at the end of time, when God says, okay, now, I'm going to explain to you what all that was about in a way that we will be able to understand. But we just don't know God. And it's, and I think, if I can say this fairly, like it is humbling to be able to say, I don't know God. I'm not God. I can't judge with my human scale. I can't judge God, because God is so big and his plan is so long, over thousands of years. I don't know if that helps you, but it does.
Of course it does. Thank you. Thank you so much, Rivka.
My pleasure. All right, I'm going to say goodbye to all of you for today. And God willing, next week we will have a more uplifting topic to talk about. But thank you for coming back and for joining me.
Thank you so much.
It was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Take care.